Today, we're taking a deep dive into a case that continues to intrigue and provoke discussion, the Menendez brothers. It's a story of wealth, privilege, and brutal family tragedy. But beyond the headlines lies a complex psychological narrative involving trauma, family dysfunction, and its profound effects on the human mind. The voice you're hearing represents a collaborative analysis by our team, drawing on expert perspectives to explore how such hidden factors might drive someone to an unthinkable act. Disclaimer: this episode is intended for educational and analytical purposes only, and does not seek to excuse or justify any actions.
All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on a case that really gets under your skin. The Menendez brothers.
Yeah, wealth and privilege, and then brutal murders.
Exactly. It's the kind of story you just can't shake.
Absolutely. And it's stuck with people for decades now. It makes you wonder why,
Well, that's what we're doing today. We're going deeper than just, the surface level.
Yeah.
And you sent over this fascinating analysis. It's a psychological deep dive, looking at these murders through the idea of childhood trauma.
Yeah, it goes right to the core of how these early experiences, especially family stuff, can really, shape a person's mind.
And sometimes with tragic results.
Right.
So the big question we're tackling is, can we ever really grasp, truly understand how two brothers from such a well-off family could end up killing their parents?
It's a question that makes us think about the power of trauma.
Especially when it happens so young.
Right, during childhood. Because it can totally warp someone's sense of reality, their coping mechanisms, and ultimately their choices.
And the analysis really hits hard right from the start, emphasizing the devastating effects of this childhood trauma. It even quotes, "Trauma during formative years has long been linked to adverse behavioral and psychological outcomes." It's pretty intense right off the bat.
It is heavy stuff. And it's important to say up front, we're not excusing what the Menendez brothers did, but we can't just ignore this potential impact of trauma in their story. They claimed years of serious abuse from their father, Jose, and neglect from their mother, Kitty.
Yeah, and it makes me think of that book, The Body Keeps the Score, by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. Have you read that one?
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic.
He talks about how trauma can literally reshape developing brain. It's almost like leaving these invisible scars.
Yeah, van der Kolk uses brain imaging to show that trauma can mess with the amygdala, the part of our brain that deals with, fear and emotion. It's like it's stuck on high alert.
So it's like living with this constant fear response.
Yeah, it's like having a car alarm going off in your head 24/7. Makes you jumpy and overreact to any little thing that seems like a threat.
Wow. So imagine living with that for years. That puts a whole new spin on things. If these brothers were constantly in that state of fear, how did that affect their ability to make good decisions?
And that takes us to another crucial piece of this puzzle, which is attachment theory.
Okay, so break that down for me. I know it has to do with how our relationships with our parents or caregivers early on can have these long-lasting effects.
Exactly. So think of it this way. Kids need that consistent, loving care to develop a secure attachment style. It's like building a solid foundation for a house, But when parenting is, let's say, inconsistent, abusive, or neglectful, well, that can lead to what we call insecure attachment. The foundation gets all shaky.
So in Lyle and Eric's case, growing up in what was reported as a chaotic and abusive home, that must have really screwed with their sense of security and their ability to form, normal relationships.
It very likely did. And the analysis points out this contrast between Lyle's more assertive personality and Eric's vulnerability.
So like two sides of the same coin. Two different ways of handling the same trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. So do you think those personality differences could actually point to different attachment styles? Like maybe one brother was always trying to please their parents while the other just shut down completely?
It's definitely possible. We know that insecure attachment can manifest in a bunch of different ways, like clinging, withdrawing, being super controlling, or even overly trusting of people they don't really know. It's like each child is trying to figure out how to survive in a world that just feels scary and unpredictable.
And that feeling of being trapped, being powerless, that makes me think of another idea this analysis brings up, learned helplessness.
Yeah, this is where the work of psychologists like Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer comes in. They describe learned helplessness as the state that develops when people experience trauma over and over again, and they just can't escape it.
So they just give up. They think nothing they do can change anything.
Exactly. Picture this. There's a dog, and it keeps getting shocked. It has no way to stop it. Eventually, that dog just stops trying to escape. Even when there's a chance to get away, It just accepts the pain.
That's awful.
It is. And in a way, this can happen with people who go through prolonged abuse. They might start to feel there's no way out, no way to change their situation.
So if the Menendez brothers truly believed they were stuck in this cycle of abuse, maybe this learned helplessness was a factor in their decision to, I mean, it's a horrible thing they did.
Yeah, it's a possibility we have to consider. It raises a huge question. Did they feel so powerless that their only option in their minds was violence?
Okay, so we've got this picture of like these two young guys potentially dealing with some serious trauma, right? Insecure attachment, learned helplessness. But this analysis goes even deeper than that.
Yeah, there's another layer here. It talks about how trauma can actually come out in someone's behavior, specifically violent behavior. The source calls this acting out.
So is that basically saying that the violence, like the murders, was a way of them expressing all this internal pain they had, pain they couldn't really put into words?
Yeah, you could interpret it that way. Think about a kid who gets hurt, but they just don't have the words to explain what they're feeling, so they might lash out physically.
Right.
Dr. Lenore Terr, who's done a lot of work on childhood trauma, she found that abuse can lead to all kinds of unhealthy behaviors, including aggression and violence.
So are we saying that killing their parents was like their extreme and obviously horrible way of acting out after all those years of alleged abuse and fear?
It's a disturbing thought, but it's definitely a possibility the analysis explores. But we got to be careful here. Trauma doesn't mean someone is automatically going to become violent. It's not that simple.
Of course, it's way more complicated than that. But when we're thinking about how trauma affects the brain, remember we were talking about the amygdala and how it's like on high alert all the time?
Right. That's a crucial point. When someone's amygdala is constantly being triggered, by past trauma, I mean, it can totally distort how they see threats.
So they might overreact.
Yeah, they might see danger where it doesn't even exist. And that can lead to these extreme defensive reactions.
Which could explain why the brothers said they were afraid for their lives, even if there wasn't like a clear and present danger right then.
Exactly. Their perception of reality might have been so messed up by trauma that any little argument could have felt like a life or death situation.
Right. And the analysis also looks at the specific environment they grew up in. It wasn't just the alleged abuse. It was also all this wealth and pressure to succeed.
Yeah, exactly. Their dad, Jose, he had this reputation for being super ambitious, ruthless even, in the business world.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
So did that pressure to live up to his expectations, I mean, did that add to this whole toxic environment?
Absolutely. You got to think about all that pressure on top of the alleged abuse. It's not hard to see how they could have felt trapped, like they had no healthy way to deal with their pain.
And you wonder if that pressure, combined with the trauma, could have actually changed their personalities, made them more prone to some, darker tendencies.
That's a really interesting point, and it's something the analysis touches on. It brings up something called the dark triad of personality disorders.
What's that?
Well, it's Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy.
Wait, hold on. Are they saying the brothers were psychopaths?
Not exactly. It's not that black and white. The analysis acknowledges that their case doesn't fit perfectly into any specific disorder, but it does raise the question, were some of the traits connected with these disorders, like manipulation or a lack of empathy? Were those amplified by the trauma they experienced?
Oh, okay. So it's not about labeling them, but more like trying to understand how trauma could twist someone's personality, make them more likely to act out in extreme ways.
Right, exactly. Imagine growing up in survival mode, constantly having to protect yourself from threats, real or perceived. It's got to be hard to develop empathy for others or to think about the consequences of your actions when you're just trying to get through each day.
And their father, Jose, was described as ambitious and ruthless. Could those be signs of some of these dark triad traits? Even if he wasn't officially diagnosed, I mean?
It's possible, but it's important not to play armchair psychologist here, We're just exploring possible connections, not trying to diagnose anyone. But the interesting thing is, the analysis brings up this guy, Dr. Robert Hare.
I think I've heard of him. He studies, what is it?
Psychopathy. He's a leading expert in the field.
Yeah, right.
And he emphasizes that, genetics can play a part in shaping certain personality traits, but it's the environment, especially what happens early on in childhood, that really determines how those traits come out.
So you're saying that even if there was some genetic predisposition toward these darker traits, their alleged trauma could have made them, way worse, more likely to act out in extreme ways.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's this complex interplay between nature and nurture, where trauma can act as this catalyst that pushes someone down a destructive path, a path they might not have taken otherwise.
And this all connects back to the legal side of things. Their lawyers argued that the murders were a direct result of this constant abuse, right?
Exactly. And this argument, it aligns with what's called the trauma-informed perspective. It's this idea that's becoming more and more important in both psychology and law. We need to understand and acknowledge the impact of trauma, especially when we're trying to make sense of why people commit crimes.
So basically, they were saying the brothers were driven to kill their parents to escape a situation they felt completely powerless to change.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They were arguing that the murders were this desperate and obviously horrific attempt to break free from this cycle of abuse. They felt trapped.
And did the forensic psychologists who evaluated the brothers, did they agree with this?
They did. The analysis mentions that the psychologists felt the brothers' behavior matched what you'd see in trauma survivors. They saw signs of, heightened stress responses, difficulty controlling their emotions, impaired judgment, all those classic symptoms of prolonged abuse.
That's a big deal. It means that even the legal system is starting to recognize how trauma can impact someone's actions.
Absolutely. And there's actual research to back this up. The Journal of Traumatic Stress, they've published studies that show a really strong link between trauma that hasn't been treated and a ton of negative outcomes. Psychological distress, substance abuse, and even violence.
Wow. So it's not just a few psychologists' opinions. There's evidence that trauma can have these profound, lasting effects on someone's life, even pushing them to do extreme things.
It really does make you think. If what the Menendez brothers did was at least partly a result of the trauma they went through, does that change how we see their responsibility for their actions?
It's a tough question. I mean, taking their parents' lives was a terrible crime. But can we really hold them completely responsible if their minds were basically warped by years of abuse?
That gets into this incredibly complicated area where psychology and the law intersect. Traditionally, the legal system focuses on intent. Did someone intentionally commit a crime? But what happens when trauma changes their whole sense of reality? What if it damages their ability to think clearly and make rational choices?
It really makes you question how we define justice, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do we balance punishment with the fact that some people, especially those who've survived serious trauma, may not be fully in control of their actions?
It's a question legal scholars, psychologists, they're still arguing about it. And the Menendez brothers case, with all its violence and those complex psychological issues, it really brought this debate to the forefront.
This feels like a good place to pause for a bit. Let everything we've talked about sink in. It's a lot to process. We'll come back to this conversation in the next part and try to unpack some of these difficult questions about trauma, guilt, and justice. Man, we've gone deep on this one. Really deep. It's hard to shake off the weight of this case, all that violence. And this idea of, how much did trauma play a part in it?
Yeah, no doubt.
What I keep coming back to is this. The analysis paints this picture of the Menendez brothers, and it's disturbing, for sure.
Yeah.
But also, you kind of, I almost feel for them.
That's the thing about this case, isn't it? It's like this paradox. They did something absolutely horrific, but they were also, they came from this messed up family, possibly abusive. It makes you think people who do terrible things, sometimes they're victims too.
Right. And it makes me wonder, about how we deal with trauma as a society. We hear all this talk about trauma-informed approaches in the legal system, but shouldn't that be, everywhere?
100%. We can't just wait until trauma explodes into something destructive.
Yeah.
We need to be dealing with the root causes, and that starts early,
Childhood.
Yeah.
So what would that even look like? More support for families, programs for kids who've been through abuse or neglect?
All of that, yeah. And think about public awareness.
Right.
Campaigns that make it okay to talk about mental health, Encourage people to get help. We got to create a culture where kids feel safe speaking up, and where the support is there if they need it.
It's like breaking a cycle, right? Because trauma, it can keep getting passed down from one generation to the next. But with the right kind of help, maybe we can stop that from happening.
Exactly. Imagine if every kid grew up feeling safe, feeling loved and supported.
Man.
Where trauma is recognized, treated, not brushed under the rug. That's the future we got to be working toward.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening, even though it's, I got to admit, some heavy stuff. This case, the Menendez brothers, it really shows just how complicated people are. If we want to create a world that's more just, more compassionate, we have to understand how deeply trauma can affect people.
And it leaves us with some big questions to think about, How can we be better at seeing the signs of trauma? How do we build environments where getting help is seen as a good thing, not a weakness?
Lots to ponder, for sure. And to everyone listening, I encourage you, keep exploring these topics. Learn about trauma, the impact it has, and the help that's out there. Understanding, that's the first step toward healing, for individuals and for all of us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Understanding the impact of trauma is crucial for both individuals and society as a whole. The Menendez case shows us that behind the most shocking acts, there can be layers of pain and psychological complexity. If this episode made you think, or if you learned something new, please subscribe to Cognitive Curves, drop us a comment, and share this with anyone interested in the psychological angles of high-profile cases. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed.